Welcome to the Mike and Doug Show. I'm Doug. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Doug.
You chased the Khazarian, Radhanite, Babylonian, whatevers across the English Channel and traced them back to their origins, which just demonstrates that what we say about that British monarchy is true. They are fully involved in patricide, fratricide, genocide, all the sides. And we now know that they're just a big group of fake people trying to use the power of the Radhanite commercial merchant predators that is now turned into what we live in every single day, including the election we just went through. So, Mike, Can you tell us what you and your hound dogs have uncovered about the Brits?
We were looking at when did usury first come to the British Isles? 1066, when William the Conqueror brought his armies from France and conquered England. And with that, he brought the Radhanite trade network from Europe to England officially, because even in various Jewish chronicles and the Jewish Encyclopedia, they cite that as the moment when Jews brought banking to England. And as we now know from our other research, that was at the exact same time as the term Ashkenazi Jew emerged in history, which we now can see was a smokescreen for the Babylonian Radhanite bankers who for several millennia had been controlling banking throughout the known world. What we see in England at about that time is these were a lot of duchies, I'll call them duchies, counties, that all had different kings. The Wessex king, the East Anglia king, there were a number of kings, and some were Vikings, some were Danes. And so the British Isles was still subject to conquest by various foreign powers. A personal story here is that when I lived in England working with the gospel music group Living Sound, we moved to Malmesbury, Wiltshire, which was about 90 miles west of London, with an abbey in it called Malmesbury Abbey. Henry VIII had torn most of it down. But in the part that was left, that was big enough to be a full church. And in that church was a tomb of the first king of England by the name of Athelstan, King Athelstan. And now, as it's turning out, that is becoming a key element in this story, because it was his grandfather who sent a delegation along the trade routes of Europe all the way to India to visit the tomb of St. Thomas in India, in Chennai. And he sent them out, and they came back. And as we can now tell, they traveled along the Radhanite trade networks throughout the known world, from England all the way to India and back. And in the process, we also know they carried a number of relics from the Holy Land back with them, including the Holy Lance, which William of Malmesbury, a very famous historian from that era, described Athelstan had in his possession. So Athelstan became the first king of all England. Up until that time, they had been fragmented in various kingdoms. And so there we see the beginning of the formation of the English culture that did not practice usury. And at that time, they didn't have any central courts. So the church, through canon law, was the primary arbiter of disputes. And they had many cases, which we're reading now, where they prosecuted people who charged usury. And they defined it simply as charging interest on a loan to a person. Then what they dealt with were various ways that people tried to get around the idea of usury. And one was kind of humorous. They talked about loaning somebody 10 shillings. And then as a part of the loan, they said, well, look, I'll loan you those shillings as long as you give me your hat. That person was prosecuted for usury because they gave him the hat. So that's how serious they were about this. We now know from our research that we've been discussing over the last several months that the Radhanite Babylonian trade network extended all the way up north into Germany and Sweden, all the way south into Morocco and North Africa, and all the way east to India and then on to China. So we knew this was a huge network, and that was the network that William the Conqueror brought in and had them start working on various forms of usury as they loaned money.
And it's so typical, because every time that the Western people went to the East, they learned their tricks. And that sounds like what this is, because here you had Alfred the Great, and then that's his son or grandson, Athelstan?
Athelstan was his son.
And so why would you send your son into some place as dangerous and as foreign all the way to the east? Because the Radhanite, the old Sogdian route, the Silk Road route that then ended up going through Khazaria, it was probably the most cultured area in the whole world, because that's where all the trade was coming from. So
Alfred's around 860.
Right. They went to the east because that's where their trade was coming from. That's where their coins were coming from. That's where their spices were coming from. That's where the wealth was coming from. You wouldn't send your son into a danger zone. So he went there to learn the tricks of the Radhanite, Khazarian Babylonians.
The trade networks were quite protected. And so that's why it wasn't as risky as we might think, because that's the way they conducted trade all the way from China to England. But England was the last of the groups to really get organized so that they had something that they could sink their teeth into relative to usury. Plus, the Christian church was quite against usury. And so what we read over the next 200 or 300 years is the ways that these Radhanite Babylonians kept pushing their attitude about usury and kept developing exceptions. And then you just saw this erosion of the whole principle over time. So by the time we get to the Warburgs in the 13th century, all the way to the Rothschilds in the 17th century, you see this erosion to the point where the Christian world then gave in and started allowing usury of any type.
They were able to take over Babylon. They were able to take over Persia. They were able to take over the Western Turks in Khazaria. They were able to take over pretty much the whole world under the auspices that you can't touch them because they're a religion and they're sacred and they're holy. And how dare you?
Something's just dawned on me, Douglas, that I had not thought of. Isn't that curious that this is exactly the same time as the First Crusade? So we have these changes that occurred, and then we have somebody was financing these soldiers to march all the way from England and France and Germany all the way to the Middle East and back, and now we know it was the Radhanite Babylonian network of bankers. Why would the Radhanites be interested in doing that? Well, if you look at the history of the First Crusade, they were fighting the Seljuk Turks, which was a nomadic group that came out of part of what is now Russia around the Ural Sea. And they started taking over the Persian empires, and they actually seized Babylon. And that is what triggered the Radhanites to move their operations and become Ashkenazi Jews. The Radhanites were pushed out of Babylon by the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks were the very army that the First Crusade was fighting. So here we have a financial motive by the Radhanite Babylonians to get the Christians of Europe to attack their enemy that drove them out of Babylon. Now things start making sense.
By the way, I'll loan you $100 if you'll give me that hat, because I'm a Catholic and I don't believe in usury, but I like the hat.